All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Neil Bradley, Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer, and Head of Strategic Advocacy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to Free the Economy, Neil.
Hey, Richard, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So that's an expressive string of titles.
Yeah.
And
doesn't cost to add more words to it, right? Yeah.
And, we often ask our guests on here a little bit about their professional background, how they got to be the impressive places that they are. How did you come to such a bundle of responsibilities in the world of U.S. business?
Yeah. So I started out on Capitol Hill. I've always been kind of a classical liberal or conservative in modern parlance, really concerned about the role and size and scope of government, and very defensive of the private sphere and the private sector. And I spent almost 20 years on Capitol Hill working in the public policy arena to further those interests. And opportunity emerged about a decade ago to join the U.S. Chamber and help lead the business community in fighting for the same things.
That's great. Now, so the U.S. Chamber, at the national level, has been working. It's been working for decades. Very old organization.
113 years.
113. Lucky one, 113.
Yeah.
Telling the story of American businesses and entrepreneurs. And, as someone who's especially interested in the topic myself, I've even collected some of the Chamber's old documents and study materials. So here are a couple. This one's from 1959. This one's from 1971. This is a very patriotic one.
Yeah.
What they call the Action Course in Practical Politics, advising people in business on how to engage in the political process, how to make their voice heard, and that sort of thing. Now, obviously, materials that were published back in the 50s or the 70s are very different from what is the fine material available online on the Chamber's website today. But
I don't know. That printing looks pretty good. Yeah.
But when it comes to 2025, what we're looking at today, what do you think are the biggest challenges to telling that story, the story of your member companies and the people who work for them? Is it the attitudes of sort of a skeptical public or even sometimes hostile public, and therefore voters, or is it the kind of threat from kind of big government policymakers, right? The guys who want to, the men and women who want to raise more taxes, pass new regulations. Where are you really focusing right now?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And it really goes back to actually those documents you pulled, from the 1959, I think you said. Politics is reflective of where the American people are. Not entirely. Politicians are leaders as well. But if you want to shape the direction that government's going, you have to engage in politics, and that means engaging with voters and the American people. I think there are two principal concerns on each front today. One is that the support or the consensus around kind of free market capitalism that really has dominated since the late 1970s is under threat from both the progressive left and recently the populist right. And so from a leadership standpoint, elected leader standpoint, we can't always rely on kind of things emerging out of that old free market consensus. And then second, I think that if you look at the survey data amongst the American people, there's more skepticism about capitalism, and in some quarters, growing support for more interventionist socialist policies that we've seen in a long time. And so I think we have to do something about both those.
In the past, it has been sort of the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C. that when Democrats were in power, whether it's in the congressional majority or in the White House, that meant more political threats to corporate America, maybe more regulation, higher corporate taxes, things like that, or the prospect of that. And with Republicans were in power, everyone just sort of assumed that things would probably go easier on the business sector. That I remember when George W. Bush was running for president initially, everyone said, "Oh well, if he wins, he'll be the first CEO president in American history, and that he'll be the new Calvin Coolidge, and it'll be all about a business-friendly environment." But of course, as you've sort of led into there in the last maybe 10 years or so since Donald Trump announced he was running for president in 2015 for the first time, we've had a lot of populism on the right and a lot of market interventions from policymakers on the right that maybe we wouldn't have had in a previous generation, whether it's people populist Republicans say we need to break up big tech companies, or obviously Trump tariff policy,
Price controls.
pretty big one.
Yeah.
So, as someone who has a lot of perspective on this, going back, a lot of experience on Capitol Hill, working in this environment, do we think this sort of trend is going to continue? Is sort of like the populist right-wing moment so identified with Trump specifically that after he's out of the White House, there'll be reversion to the mean? Where do you think this is taking us?
Yeah, I don't know many people who suggest that kind of in a post Donald Trump world that things just kind of revert to the pre-Trump approach, and it's been a long time since the president's been on the scene, and he and others have certainly influenced how the party approaches a lot of those issues. But it's also occurring in a wider context, right? At the same time that more progressive forces are influencing the Democratic side. I don't really know where this ends. What I can suggest, though, is that if people who believe in markets, like the folks at CEI, like the folks at the U.S. Chamber and a lot of allies around the country, if we don't try to shape the future and the direction of the government's relationship with business, we're going to end up in a worse place than we otherwise would have been. And I take some comfort in the fact that, we've been here before. Right. And so we were talking before about, Richard Nixon's quip in, I think, 1972 to New York Times reporter that when it comes to the economy, we're all Keynesians now, all in favor of government intervention. And I mean, he really meant it. Like, 2 days later, he signed an executive order imposing wage and price controls across the economy. That is government intervention. There's nothing free market about that. And he was a Republican president.
And famed for being an anti-communist.
But the consensus around government intervention into markets was so strong then that was a acceptable political place for a Republican president to be. And then, a few short years later, not even a decade later, thanks to the folks who ended up founding CEI, thanks to the folks at the Chamber, thanks to a lot of other organizations, the tide fundamentally shifted. And we said, you know what, all this government intervention, all this government regulation is actually making our problems worse, not better. And we reversed course. So I, by nature, am an optimist, and I have a lot of optimism that we can get on a better path.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's not just a turn in one direction, I don't feel like. So, just like with, Nixon being a surprisingly interventionist, surprising to some people, interventionist as a Republican president, it's not like the Trump White House and Republicans today have just sort of gone in the opposite direction. I feel like there's kind of a bifurcated approach in some ways, where there's some prominent voices in the Republican Party who are sort of anti-big tech people. Maybe Josh Hawley, for example, maybe an example of those voices saying, we need more aggressive antitrust enforcement. We need to break up big companies. But at the same time, you have plenty of voices specifically within like the White House team saying, no, we need to defend America's successful tech companies because they're an example of great American ingenuity, American economic leadership. The very first major speech the vice president gave was in Paris saying, you EU regulators can't come after our the big tech companies we love so much. So I feel like there are kind of multiple strains that are kind of jockeying for prominence here, and that maybe part of the way for Americans to be proud of their successful companies is a sort of nationalist or kind of patriotic approach, in a way that just saying, we want the greatest economic efficiency and the highest GDP numbers, so we should let big companies do whatever they want. That's, it's jarring to a lot of people today. That's not like the emotionally the message they connect to. You could say, look at these great American companies.
Yeah.
Lots of like brilliant, hardworking people have brought valuable products that millions of people have decided to pay for, and we shouldn't let foreign bureaucrats kneecap them.
Right. Yeah, I think this has always been true. So I don't think this is new, but I think it's something that defenders of markets should be wary of. There are a lot of arguments that work in favor of defense of U.S. companies or market outcomes that aren't grounded in the market. We should champion U.S. companies because they're U.S. companies. In some instances, that argument can lead you to oppose overregulation by foreign entities. That's a good outcome to defend U.S. Companies, global leaders from the French trying to tax and regulate them into oblivion. It can also lead you, if that's your only argument, into bad places where you can protect companies from market forces, prevent them from having to innovate in order to compete on the grounds that, well, they're here and that there are companies. And so we can appreciate that some arguments do work with folks, but that at the end of the day, it's important to kind of go back to market fundamentals, which I think gets to the larger point that you kind of started with your question there. There's a big debate going on within each party. So if you're on the political right, it's easy to see the debate going on the Democratic side between the Democratic Socialists and the progressives and the more traditional or kind of reasonable Democrats on one hand. But to ignore the debate that's going on within your party because we're all unified. By the way, the Democrats do the same thing. They're no. We're actually much more unified than what would suggest it's the Republicans in which there's this big debate going on. The truth is there's a big debate going on within each party that has real implications for our approach to the relationship between the private sector and government, and therefore has real ramifications for our future growth and prosperity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is just the structure of American politics in general. If we were a parliamentary democracy and we had 6 major parties, there wouldn't be as much struggle within each one.
Right.
But basically, we're sort of like a parliamentary democracy with 3 left-wing parties lumped into one big party and 3 right-wing parties, center-right parties lumped into the other side. And so there's always there's kind of a dynamic equilibrium. Like at any one point, maybe you can kind of say where the parties are, but it's always in a certain amount of ferment.
And just to build on that for a second, and it's always the case, as it should be, that even within those divisions in the party, the 2 parties themselves have differences, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a good thing. We don't want a monolithic, it doesn't matter which party you pick, you get the same kind of result. But it does matter, I think, for markets and for our system that there are generally accepted parameters within which both parties operate, right? And so it might be that within those generally acceptable parameters, one side's further to the right within that kind of consensus and the other side, the other political parties to the left. But that consensus matters. And that, I think, is as these debates go on within each party, what I think is at most at risk is that the consensus fundamentally shifts and might shift in a way that for both parties is more government interventionist than it has been the last 50 years. Yeah,
I mean, I think I always call that the Overton window.
It is that's exactly right.
I was on a podcast recently called the Overton window. It was great. So, when it comes to, again, talking about what voters think, but I think also often more important what they feel, right? Because a lot of this is more about values than it is about sort of like rigorously researched policy positions. One of my, and therefore sort of using that understanding to think about like, well, how do we talk to people about these issues? One of my personal theories about sort of capitalism versus socialism versus, say, nationalism is that, most Americans aren't ideologues. They don't have an internally consistent set of well-ordered political beliefs the way that political science nerds do when they debate each other. They're basically, they're normal people, and they want things to work. They want
Yep.
things in their life to work.
That's right.
If things in other places work, that's great too. But they're more concerned about things in their life.
Yeah, as they should be.
So, they want housing, groceries, healthcare, higher education. They want things like that to be affordable, even abundant, to use a word we're using a lot more these days. So, and this is why I kind of worry about political errors. So, bad public policies are to be avoided because they have bad consequences in general, right, for their own sake. But bad government policy also disrupts those things that are important to people's lives, which they then blame businesses for.
Yes. And politicians blame the businesses for it because after all, it can't be a result of their policy error.
Right. So so when it comes to, again, like say political decisions that are, we got zoning decisions for housing make it hard to build new housing. The price of housing goes up. And then someone says, oh, it's the Blackstone Group that's buying all the houses and causing prices to go up, which that is not a good diagnosis. So it's not a correct diagnosis at the very least. Where do you see specific instances of this happening? And how do you deal with talking to a person at like a town hall meeting, right? Who says, I'm sick and tired of these prices going up. I want someone to hold Walmart accountable. And you have to explain to them, well, the reason prices is going up is not because of Walmart. In fact, Walmart's the only reason prices are held as low as they are in some places. It's this law, that regulation, and here's these other 10 things that are making your life more expensive.
Yeah, so tariffs. Let's use tariffs as an example, right? So the whole purpose of tariffs is to raise the domestic price of something. You can do it because you want to raise revenue, or you can do it because you want to protect the incumbent industry, or you want to deter consumption. Whatever your reason, it operates by effectively raising the price. I'm actually very heartened by the fact that if you look at most polling, whether or not people support the tariffs or oppose the tariffs, whether or not they're Republican or Democrat or independent, they intuitively understand that imposing tariffs on something is going to raise the price of it. And so in some ways, there is a kind of functioning understanding of that. I think thought leaders we can do a better job of reiterating kind of that at times and reminding the truth of that. I think there are places where maybe we haven't done as good of a job. Housing, as you mentioned, is a perfect example of that. That it's a little, it takes a couple of steps to connect the zoning restrictions to the reason that you don't have affordable housing in the area that you might in the city or that you might want to live in. But I think we can make progress there too. And shame on us for not doing a good enough job over the last 20 years of drawing that connection.
An organization like like the Chamber has a lot of kind of arrows in its quiver, right? You can do lobbying, sit down with members of Congress and say, here's our case for this or that. You can run ads, right? You can do polling. You got a whole network of state affiliates, and you can push out information that way. But one of, certainly here in Washington, D.C., among people who do policy advocacy work, one of the real big guns, I feel like, is a strategic litigation program. And that's in some ways where the rubber hits the road, where like headlines pop up and people sort of notice, oh, Supreme Court here's oral argument on XYZ policy. How do you decide when to sue the government?
It's not a decision we take lightly. We do it a fair amount and have for 40 years, just over 40 years now since the founding of our in-house kind of litigation center. I think a couple of things kind of come together. One is that the government is clearly overstepping its bounds. It's if it's a regulatory agency, they're violating the law that was passed by Congress, or they're not following the procedures that Congress has laid out. If it's Congress or a state legislature, sometimes it's because they're violating what they're proposing violates the Constitution, or if it's at the state level violates federal law. So at its core, there are lots of laws that we don't like or regulations that we don't like, but that are perfectly legal. We would never sue over those because there's nothing unlawful about making bad policy decisions if you do it in a lawful way. So first, it's got to be unlawful. The second thing is that it really has negative impacts on the ability of the private sector to operate, to innovate, to allow decisions to be made by market forces. And so when government's coming in and putting its thumb on the scale and it's using illegal powers to do that, you'll likely find us in court.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, going back again to try to get the normal, the mythical, normal, average, Americans, view on these things and not just the sort of DC version. One of the things that, I've talked about before here on the show and other places, and I think the Chamber spent a lot of time thinking about this as well, is that, when it comes to how Americans view capitalism, the free market system, the national economy, economics and finance in general. Yeah. A lot of them don't think of those things as having anything to do with them. They're like, I'm a normal person. They sort of imagine that, if you're a billionaire, if you're a Wall Street investor, if you're a CEO, of course you worry about all that stuff because that's your world. You're part of that. But they're like, that doesn't have anything to do with them, right? And therefore, they would not necessarily be upset by greater regulation on that world, right? Because that's the big guys have to worry about that. But the vast majority of people have adults out there. They have a job, they have a resume, they have an income. Those are all kind of business type things, even if they don't think of them as being
totally.
And everyone has to manage household expenses. They have to worry about retirement. They have to pay their bills. And I believe there's one self-help author once there who put it that they're the CEO of their own career. They're the CEO of their own life.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
As they have to be. So how do we talk to people about sort of that aspect? About like there's a big economy out there, and sometimes it's talked about in like giant billion-trillion-dollar abstractions, which normal people kind of like their eyes closed over, reasonably so. But I always say like, no, you're part of all of this too. Yeah. And what happens to things like growth and employment, like then that will affect your life.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, I think we're I fall into this trap myself. Sometimes we're too quick to say capitalism or socialism and expect everyone to just jump to our shorthand of kind of about what that means. I think it's completely reasonable. In fact, preferential that people don't wake up every day kind of thinking about that in their normal lives. So we have to talk to them in the way that it meets their normal life. Part of that comes down to who do you want making decisions for you and for your family and for your community? And do you want the government making decisions about the type of car you're allowed to buy? Or should you be allowed to decide the type of car? Who do you think is going to do a better job coming up and inventing things or providing services to meet your needs? Do you think the government's going to do a better job of that? Or do you think people competing for your business, competing for your attention, for your dollar of wallet are going to do a better job? And when you ask it and you put it in those kind of ways, people overwhelmingly favor markets, and they understand that that markets do a better job of meeting their needs and kind of creating growth. I think there are other things that we can do to put some of these growth things in context. I happen to ascribe to the view that at its core, the American dream really comes down to the idea that my parents had it better than their parents. I have it better than my parents did. And my goal is for my son to have it better than my wife and I do. Well, how does that happen, right? And one of the ways it happens is that your life represents a slice of the bigger economic pie. And if the economic pie is getting bigger, the opportunity for your slice to get bigger. And so we often talk about our goal at the U.S. Chamber is to get back to real, sustained 3% GDP growth. To most Americans, that means nothing. But when I say that the difference between 3%, where we historically were, and 2%, where we've been for over the past decade on average, is the difference between the pie doubling in 22 years or the pie doubling in about 33, 34 years. It's the difference between the time someone's born and the time they're starting their career, the size of the pie doubling and the chance for their share to double versus waiting until they're well into their career, they're in their mid-30s. And when it takes that long, people understandably start to question, is the American dream real for me still? Because I don't have it better off than my parents did.
Well, yeah, it reminds me of something Mick Mulvaney used to say when he was part of the first Trump administration. He said he made a very similar point about how, well, we want to get from a 2% growth to 3% growth every year, and he said the problem was with those small numbers. People, it doesn't sound like very much. And he said, but remember, going from 2% to 3% is not a 1% increase; it's a 50% increase.
Yes, yeah.
And so if you ask people like, should we have a policy that grows the economy 50% faster? People be like, oh yes,
absolutely.
That sounds exciting.
And
right?
do you think that you're going to be better off if the economy is growing 50% faster? Absolutely. You think that you're appropriately, because it's true, that you're going to have better chances, better jobs, higher wages. Your family is much more likely to be better off. This is one of the things I love about America, right? Like, unlike our friends in Europe, like we are not very tolerant of low growth. Like we look around at 2% growth and we may not be able to identify that's the source of our unease, but I believe it is the source of a lot of people's unease. And that's a good thing. And so I think, the job of the U.S. Chamber is to channel that unease into the policies that can get us from 2% growth to 3% growth. Because the American people are never going to be comfortable, Lord willing, in a world in which we grow like Europe at 2% a year.
Yeah, it reminds me of this book I just read about the growth of the Chinese economy by Dan Wang called Breakneck, about how the Chinese government is trying to engineer long-term sustained economic growth and innovation over there, the difference between a system like that and the U.S. system, and what if anything we want to learn from that? And so we've got some some prominent people who said, oh, actually the United States needs to be more like China, right? For economic planning reasons, industrial policy reasons, and that the significant increase in China's economy. They're doubling in the past few decades has been even faster than that, and I instinctively find that problematic and unpleasant. But getting past the instinctive reaction, I feel like this is a situation, and it's one of the most next to the end of the Soviet Union and the fall of global communism, at least European communism, China's success over the past 30 years is the biggest economic story in the world in modern times. And it would be very easy to learn the wrong lessons from that. And in this new book, the author, very much to his credit, says, well, actually, even if there's some things about China's economy that the United States can learn, China should learn things from the United States, like, having a First Amendment or having legally enforceable rights for its citizens, which I'm like, maybe that's actually even more important. But the idea that some industrial policy advocates have said, oh, well, we need to be more like China, basically, kind of reminds me a little bit of what people said in the 1930s, which is like there's an infamous Wall Street Journal editorial from 100 years ago that said, well, maybe what we need is an American Mussolini, right, to whip us into shape. That would definitely have been learning the wrong lesson 100 years ago. So, how can we look at the success of China, our now most obvious sort of strategic competitor out there in the world economically as well as sort of militarily, and say, what can we learn from them, if anything, and how can we keep our industrial policy nerds from learning the wrong lesson?
Yeah. It's so important that we don't learn the wrong lesson from this. And let me draw a parallel to the U.S. experience, right? So post World War II, we're the only industrial economy left. We get to turn plane factories into washing machine factories and automobile factories. A short time later, early 1960s, the first baby boomers start entering the workforce, and they keep coming in waves and waves and waves. Women who in the early 1960s, only about a third were in the workforce, start entering the workforce in kind of record numbers. For any economy, that is wind at your back, right? Mm-hmm. And it turns out you can grow even if you make really bad public policy decisions when you have that type of wind at your sails. The challenge comes when you have more baby boomers retiring, as we do today, than you have new people coming into the workforce. When you've kind of reached, in essence, you're not going to double the number of women participating in the workforce. It's a mathematical impossibility kind of at this point. You've kind of reached that. We're now operating in a world in which we have many industrial competitors. So we don't have those tailwinds anymore, which means that we have to get a lot of market policies right to get the growth that we want. We're fortunate in the United States that we have a very entrepreneurial, inventive economy. It's actually the envy of the Chinese, because if you look at the Chinese, they had a lot of wind at their back too. The opportunity to industrialize a huge population that they could pull in from rural and farm areas, a growing population boost to kind of power an economy. And it turns out you could make a lot of public policy mistakes and still grow really fast when you had that kind of demographic structures the Chinese had. Now they're reaching the point where the population is getting smaller every year. They have an inability to pull folks into that workforce. They have manufacturing competitors and other Asian economies, and they're going to run the test. I think they're going to fail in the idea that they can sustain that type of economic growth with really bad policies. The lesson they should learn from us, and I know it's one that they can't reconcile with their politics, is that they need an economy that encourages the type of entrepreneurialism, risk-taking, and invention that we have in the U.S. And that's the circle that they can't square.
Mm-hmm. You know, my old friend and mentor, Fred Smith, and we are in a studio named after him right now, rest in peace, he liked to say about economic growth and entrepreneurship that you don't have to teach the grass to grow. You just have to move the rocks off the lawn.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that's sort of like the antithesis of, again, the Chinese idea.
Completely.
The idea that you need a complete landscape garden master plan before a single blade of grass can grow. And, you know, we've often said, you know, in recent years that policymakers should deregulate to stimulate. Right. Everyone talks about we need, you know, economic stimulus for this or that. We've got things like the CHIPS Act, you know, billions of dollars targeted certain areas. But those things are expensive and sometimes they're politically contentious. So that instead of, you know, subsidies and targeted tax breaks for specific industries or tariffs, we'd get more bang for our buck, you know, economically, to just repeal the unnecessary stuff that is holding, you know, I'd say businesses back, but individuals back, the whole country back. Right. So, you know, and obviously, this is a topic that people at Chamber have thought about a lot over the years. So, you know, consider having a Harry Potter moment with magic wand and say, you can sort of normalize this for how politically difficult it would be. But so, you know, take how advantageous repealing a policy would be times how hard it would be to pass, and then you get sort of an index value of like what we should go after first. What rocks would you move off that lawn of the U.S. economy first?
Yeah. Well, let me pick a couple. I'd start with labor regulation. So we have labor regulation that was basically written in the 1930s for the way people worked in the 1930s.
Including by some people who admired Mussolini.
Right. no one works that way today, and there's the ability to people change jobs over the course of their career. They change industries over the course of their career. The ability to start your own business like it has existed like it never has kind of before. But yet we regulate labor like it's the 1930s. I would have a complete reimagination of our approach to labor. And that is both broadly and within individual industries. When we think about our shortage of air traffic controllers, excessive regulation that doesn't allow people to actually train to be proficient on the job in the way that modern technology allows you to train. We've decided that we want to train people the way we trained them 30 years ago. That's not the job anymore. And technology, we shouldn't pretend it is, or that technology hasn't advanced. Same way as we operate trucks and railroads and all kinds of individual industries. I think in a lot of areas, we've decided to regulate via the court system and liability. I think that's certainly true in the environment, energy spaces, development. We need kind of clear rules of the road that if you're following them, you know that the government's not going to pull the rug out from under you, or someone's going to go to court and pull the rug out from under you 5 or 6 years from now. I think that's an area where we need to lift the rock. An area where we were making progress a decade ago and lifting the rock that we've stopped, and unfortunately now we're adding heavier rocks on top of it, is obviously trade. And so that's a big area. I think America has benefited greatly by trading with the world. And the rest of the world is now deciding to go on without us in trading. And I worry we're going to kill a lot of grass.
Yeah, and I guess finally, as someone who's in charge of a lot of stuff at a big famous organization that's been around for a long time, 113 years, how do you all move with the spirit of the day and not get locked into stuff you were doing 30 years ago? Because I feel like from the sort of like organizational efficiency, there's certain sort of theories out there in the world of business school or management theory that a big, large organization has a lot of advantages. That's well known. It has an established brand. It has lots of friends, but that it's very easy to get A, risk averse, or B, path dependent, and just keep doing what you've always done in the past because it's always worked in the past, right? And one of our former guests, Gary Shapiro, wrote a book called Pivot or Die, and he said the hard, he said he lays out various ways in which managers and leaders have to pivot, and he said in some ways the hardest one is the pivoting from success. Because it's easy when everything is falling apart. You got to pivot in a new direction, but when you're successful, it's easy to think you don't have to keep innovating. So as the sort of preeminent American business association out there that people look to, how do you say, okay, well, we're not going to print out 10,000 newsletters a year. We're going to get on TikTok or whatever it is, whatever the new strategy is. How do you keep that fire underneath you when you've got that very cozy building right by the White House there?
Yeah. Like for any organization, I think it's a challenge, right? And you have to be intentional about confronting that challenge. One of the I will say wonderful things about the U.S. Chamber, and it's not exclusive to us. There are other successful organizations where this is true, is that we have the ability to attract young talent, and we've managed to maintain a culture that encourages them to innovate and to challenge those of us who've been there a while in why are you doing it this way? Is there a better way to do this? So I think that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it, and it's a little bit about much of what we've talked about today, which is recognizing that the world is changing. And in some ways it's changing in ways that we don't like, right? The lessening support for capitalism and free markets, the growing willingness of both parties to be interventionist. And to remind ourselves to openly talk about that, because in openly talking about it, we confront the fact that means that clearly everything that worked before isn't working today. So what do we have to do, if our mission and our objective is to preserve the freest market possible for American innovation. And so sometimes people say you're talking too much about the threats and you're not talking about much about the good stuff going on. Most business leaders I know, the reason they innovate is because they're talking about the threat from their competitor or they're talking about the threat from their customers going somewhere else. And so I think it's a little bit healthy to be motivated but by the things that you see not going right. And so we have an obligation to talk about those so that we're focused on innovating to change them.
All right. We're going to stay nimble.
Absolutely.
All right, Neil, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me on. And thank you so much for the work that you and the CEI do in defending markets.
Yeah, and where should all of our listeners and viewers go to get all this amazing material from the chamber?
Yeah, uschamber.com. uschamber.com is the best place to stay up to date.
All right, thanks again.
Thanks so much.